We're very happy to have Tom Sargent with us. He really doesn't need any introduction, Nobel Prize laureate. And he will talk about debts and taxes for almost 200 years in the United States. And we know he has worked on this topic. He has shaped the field in macroeconomics. He has shaped all our fiscal perspective and monetary perspectives on that. And we're very excited to hear about this new project. He will tell us historical project, and he's unique in a sense that he can bring really hardcore macro technical results together with historical insights. And Tom, the floor is yours. We are looking forward to it.
Okay, so here goes. Thanks, Marcus. Okay, so one of my favorite quotes is by George Stigler, who said that a war can ravage half a continent and raise no new issues in economic theory. And that's going to kind of pervade this thing. So this is going to be a strange talk. I'm going to give you a progress report on a long-standing project that's gone on a decade or two. It's with George Hall, Jonathan Payne, and Balint Zoke. And I'm going to give you a reader's guide to some papers. There's going to be some equations in the back of our heads, but there's going to be very few equations in this slide. I'm going to show you some graphs. So, so in addition to with George, Jonathan, and Balint, Julia, Python, and Pandas are also kind of co-authors of this project. So here's the idea. We've collected data on promised payouts, prices, and quantities of every US government note or bond that has been issued since the beginning of our country in 1775. Okay, so big effort has been made to collect that. Okay, so those are the data. And what we're going to do is we're going to stare at the data. Of course, if you just stare at data and ask them to speak to you, they won't tell you anything. So we need some quote unquote inductive biases to get them to speak to us. So what we're going to have is government budget constraints. And then we're going to have in the back of our head we're going to have Arrow-Hicks asset pricing theory. And we're going to have two models of tax smoothing, one due to Barrow and one due to Lucas and Stokey. So, you know, the graphs we're going to show you are kind of motivated by those inductive biases or theories. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a reader's guide to some papers, and you know, if we I won't do it here. If we click this, you can find the papers every time we click. Okay, so here goes. So data assembly. So we've assembled, created. Jonathan Payne and George Hall did a huge amount of work on this. Quantities and prices of these data. They're on GitHub. And what we have is payout streams, prices, and quantities of every US bond that Congress has issued. If you go to that website, you can find them in Python and Pandas data frames. And that's what we're building on. Okay, so the next thing is we have an accounting framework. And we have our own accounting framework. Because, why? Because the US government has had an accounting framework. It's actually set up by Alexander Hamilton in 1790. Turns out the government accounts, in particular the government accounts that report interest payments on the US government debt and report government federal debt, those accounts don't line up with macroeconomic theory or monetary theory. They don't answer the questions that macroeconomic theory wants. Maybe it's an interesting question to ask, what, if any, questions do those accounts answer? But that's another story. So therefore, because those accounts, what George and I did in this paper, we used government budget constraints and Arrow-Hicks pricing formulas to construct values of government debts and returns on government debts, because those returns are what's in the government budget constraint in the models that we built. For example, the Lucas-Stokey model or the Barrow model. So I'm just going to show you some graphs of what differences it make. So this picture goes from 1790 to 2020. The blue line is the number reported in the government statistics, and the black line is what the interest payments really are according to economic theory. And you'll notice a couple things. The interest payments, the Arrow-Hicks interest payments are all over the place. You know, they're quite volatile. And sometimes they can differ a great deal. So you can find that. What about the value of government debt? The government misreports that. In a nutshell, they don't mark to market. They do not mark to market. And what they do, they completely ignore coupons, and they just report the par value of government debt and add them up. And then they do something funny with treasury bills. You know, that's not what Arrow or Hicks would tell you to do. So here, the par value, the red line is what the government reports, and the blue line, as percentage of GDP, is what George and my accounting system. Yes, and there's periods when that makes a difference. You could ask, isn't it remarkable? After the Revolutionary War period, and except for the Civil War, they aren't that far apart, and that didn't have to happen. And there's an interesting reason why it didn't happen, but it's because of the way the government has designed its securities. But that's another story. Anyway, so then I'll show you one more picture. I love this picture and love staring at it. This is if you could ask, this is the picture that you want if you want to apply either the Barrow model or the Lucas-Stokey tax smoothing model in the US. George and I are going to be working on a paper where we're going to, in the line of Stigler's thing, we're going to apply this to, we're going to go beyond 2020. And so here's what you notice. During wars, the blue line is expenditures, the dotted line is receipts. So notice the following thing. During wars, there's big deficits. And then also what happens is there seems to be a permanent increase in government expenditures. There's a transient component, but then there's a permanent component after the Civil War. Look at World War I. Jump in expenditures, and then move it to a higher permanent level. Thinking this is a time series model. There's some jumps in this process. Look at World War II and this. So here's the pattern. Big deficits during the war, in the US at least, followed by a permanent component of the increase in government expenditures. And now it's really tempting to, I'm a pattern recognition guy, like all of us. So there's a pattern there. And now there's a war on COVID. And the war on COVID, you could say, well, no one's actually getting, it's the virus that's shooting us. But I'm a macro guy, and what it is if I show you the surge in government expenditures, and then I show you the big government deficit, it's kind of tempting to ask us, well, what's going to happen during the COVID thing, and what's going to happen after? Is there going to be a permanent increase? So history poses this question.
The expenditures are without interest payments. No, they don't include the interest payments.
They do include interest payments.
Okay.
They do include interest payments. Done right, done George and my way. And kind of what's the Barrow's advice? The Barrow's advice is run a deficit during the war, and then after the war, increase expenditures by just enough to increase taxes by just enough to service the debt. But if you drill down, this permanent increase in expenditures is it's more than enough to finance the interest payments on the debt. I'll just tell you that. And the same thing after World War I and World War II. This wasn't just debt repayment. It's a great question, Marcus. Okay. Oh, here's the debt. Here's the history of U.S. debt GDP, and these colors show who owned the debt. And just think of COVID and think of okay. So until the Great Depression, when the government issued debt, private investors held it. That's the blue line. But then starting in the 30s, government agencies and trust funds and the Federal Reserve started owning it. And then look after World War II, and then look what's happened in the 2000s, especially after 2008 and after COVID. So these numbers, so a lot of this government debt is owned by government agencies. We have to keep track of that. And by the way, that talk about the independence of the central bank. It's always a fiction or a convention, and it's become much more of one because the central bank, at least in the United States, is doing a lot of fiscal policy, interest on reserves, and so on. Okay, so this framework's been adopted by other people. There's a British version and there's an Indian version. Okay, I'm going to go to another paper. And this is kind of in the Chicago Adam Smith tradition of looking for cross-country evidence. So this is a paper I wrote 10 years ago for the JP, United States then, Europe now. And the whole, what the paper focuses on, I've learned a lot more about this since then. Who controls the power of the purse in a federal arrangement? And the United States has done it two ways. So the question is, who controls monetary policy and the power of the purse? So what the first 10 years of the United States is we did it the European way before the European Central Bank. There were 13 states. They ran their own quote unquote monetary policies, issued their own money. They ran their own fiscal policies. They actually ran their own tariff policies. So that it was a government which was kind of a very weak central government, had no power to tax, couldn't regulate, and so on. The government, both the central government and the state governments had huge debt overhang from financing the war. And there's 10 years of struggle on whether those debts are going to be paid or defaulted on, and whether or not, and if they're going to be paid, who's going to pay them? So there's some smart guys like Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton, and they have the idea, well, actually the idea wasn't original with them. They have the idea is, look, if we can make a deal where we'll strengthen the federal government, we'll have the states surrender their power to regulate money and to impose taxes and surrender that to the central government in exchange for the central government using its power to tax to service both the state government debts and the central government debts. So it's going to be the institutions are going to be rearranged so that the center has the ability to bail out the states. It's going to bail out the states presumably once and for all. So that program, there was a counter program. There were guys who said, oh, and they did this first. They said, well, wait a minute. We don't like a big central government. We like strong state governments. So we're just going to flip it. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the state of Pennsylvania raise enough taxes on Pennsylvania residents to pay off, to service Pennsylvania state debt, and also central government debt that's owned by Pennsylvania citizens. So New York did this, Rhode Island did this, a number of states were starting to do this. So it's kind of a contest for 10 years. Who's going to bail out whom? Maybe this rings a bell. So what eventually happens is the nationalists won. It's kind of a miracle. It's almost it is literally a coup d'etat. And that's how our US Constitution, kind of our second Constitution, was founded. So lots of strings attached. If there's a Broadway musical called Hamilton, there's kind of a myth in the sociologist sense that Hamilton paid off the debt at par. Big haircuts, but he actually big and discriminatory haircuts. But he basically for lots of guys, he paid off 65 or 75% of the debt. Okay, so that's what that story is, and that makes you think of some other countries, because similar things are going on in Europe and in places like China. Okay, so so one thing that's going on here is, if you look at the founding fathers of the United States, they're really sophisticated, and kind of one theme that actually Neil Wallace was doing really creative work on this was in the 80s about using a price discrimination logic, applying that to fiscal policy, and paying different rates of return to different classes of creditors in order to minimize deadweight losses. And if you kind of look at what, that's kind of a theme for the first 50 years of the United States. So here's what Alexander Hamilton, and this is in this paper. It's going to set up another paper. What they did is they offered, I told you that Hamilton, in the musical, and he bails out state government debt. He bails out lots of federal debt, completely pays foreign debt. No haircuts on foreign debt, which is interesting. Okay, but there's one class of debt holders he really he pays 1 cent on the dollar, and that's people who hold money. IOUs that were promising to pay Spanish dollars, they paid 1 penny on the dollar. So, and they did that intentionally. They wanted the founding fathers, and if you read the debates of the Constitution, read this August 17th, 1787. What the founding fathers wanted to do was poison money. They never wanted to use the inflation tax again to finance a big surge in expenditures. And there's a big discussion about that. There's unanimity that they want to do that. So what they want to do is they want to poison, look what they want to do. They want to poison their reputation for ever issuing money. And the way they're going to do it is they're going to give you really crappy return on what they did in the past. And then what they're kind of saying, they know some game theory, even though it's 200 years before von Neumann. They're going to poison that. But what they're saying, but by the way, large denomination stuff to rich guys, we are going to honor. So what they're trying to do is they're anticipating a Freudenberg-Krebs 1990s argument in the R.E. Stud about how you can, the same party can sustain different reputations with different audiences. And that's what they're trying to pull off. Okay, so that's what comes out. So now that sets up another paper. that's what we came out of the revolution. There's this paper with George Hawk. It's called Fiscal Discriminations in 3 Wars. And what are the 3 wars? The Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. And I'll tell you what, and what this is all about. Again, the government budget constraints there and rates of return on different classes of government debts. It's about inflationary finance and post-war returns. So, and the bottom line, and so there's classic issues: money versus bonds, greenbacks, legal tender, and the gold standard. Creating and then resolving ambiguity, all of these things, and reputation. And there's larger than life figures: James Madison, Ulysses S. Grant, and Andrew Johnson. So you know, the question that I set up for you is, the founding fathers wanted to poison using money to finance wars. The inflationary finance. And so what happens is the United States gets in a war with Britain in 1812. And by the way, a lesson from this is wars always have unintended consequences, and they don't go well for anybody. The idea that you think you can win a trade war or a shooting war, forget it. And if you're from Britain, you know that. You won 2 world wars and you lost monetary hegemony, and that wasn't a coincidence. Okay, so we get into the War of 1812, and James Madison, he's one of the ones who spoke out against wanting to poison currency. So here's what he does, is the US does issue some stuff that looks like currency during the war. There is some inflation, but then after the war, there's very high rates of return on things that look like money. And if you read it, they even tried to make sure that people knew that this wasn't like the Revolutionary War. So there's a reputational story going on there. Then in the Civil War, so you kind of ask, this is why in history is important to remember. What we learn from events when you're young, when you're 20, or when you're a policymaker, when you're 45 or 50, you're kind of very influenced by those observations. And the message of the Civil Wars, there's a great contest. The U.S. issues, it goes off gold. And the presumption is, and it issues a paper currency, okay? Despite the advice of the founding fathers. But everybody kind of has the view that, well, this is temporary. And after the war, we're going to go back on gold. And if you do that, notice the following thing. This is kind of a Rudy Dornbush great paper. If you go off gold and the greenbacks, the paper money goes at a discount, just think it through. Then after the war, if you actually go back on gold, you're giving a high return, excess return relative to gold, to the people who trusted that you're going to go back. And that, in the event, that's what ultimately happened. But after the Civil War, there's a great political debate between Ulysses S. Grant and Andrew Johnson about whether or not you should go back to gold, and furthermore, whether or not you should pay off all the bonds that had promised to issue gold. You should just pay them off with greenbacks. So this, and the Democratic Party platform said, yeah, let's have some inflation and hurt creditors. So that debate about using, quote, monetary fiscal policy to redistribute, or some people would say insure, it's hard to tell the difference, redistribute, was going on then. And it's going on behind closed doors now in the United States. Yeah, that's another story. And then finally, here's something that I love. It fascinates me. There's these classic things called 520 bonds. And here's how they're my favorite of all US bonds. So here's what happens. During the Civil War, the US is, think about this, the US goes off gold. It issues this currency called greenbacks. They're legal tender for all public and private debts, except tariff payments. They have to be paid in gold. So there's a discrimination. So they issue, at the same time, the government issues these 520 bonds. And here's what they are. They're 20-year bonds. They offer 6% coupons payable in gold. They're callable by the government at par after 5 years. That's what's the 520. And I've told you everything about the bond except what the principal is payable in. And there, it's not said. It's completely ambiguous on whether or not the legislation doesn't say either gold or greenbacks. It's just silent. So after the war, there's a big controversy. What are we going to pay them in? Big political fight. After the war, they end up being paid effectively in gold. So there's a big story there about, and that discussion there, you think, Krebs and Wilson invented reputational economics and Abreu, Pearson, Stiketty. Well, they did beautiful work of formalizing it, but it's actually describing, it describes in like a glove what's being discussed here. Okay. Okay. So I want to show you something. Okay, I want to show you a graph. The Civil War and World War I. And this is a graph of the way, this is a graph of the price level. When the United States was on the gold standard during two big wars. So here's the way this goes. This red line is the log of the price level during the Civil War. So when we go on greenbacks, these are the legal tender price level. We go in the war. We finance the war partly by issuing these greenbacks, and there's some inflation. And then the war ends, and then after the war, we go back to the gold standard. And how do we do it? We engineer long deflation down to here, or we preside over a long deflation. That's what happens, okay? That's a Civil War. And now, let's look at World War I. And you have to say, if you read the memoirs of the Secretary of Treasury during World War I, William Gibbs McAdoo, he's very influenced by what happened during the Civil War. He studies it. And he wants to do better. So here's what happens during the World War I. So here's the price level. I've lined it up. Notice these dates. The blue dates are the later dates. So we get into the war. There's a big inflation during the war. Why? It's kind of interesting. It's partly Europe exported a bunch of inflation to us. Big war. The war ends. And then what happens is after the war, the price level sinks quite rapidly. And look, it looks like it wants to copy. So here's my story. It looks like this is numerology, but it looks like it wants to copy what happened after the Civil War to get back on the world gold standard. So there's a force pushing prices down. Okay, but so then what happened was, look, it got arrested. Something happened in the early 20s. And guess what happened? It's the British with the gold exchange standard. They patched together a kind of a gold standard with lots of credit, lots of IOUs, and lots of countries going back on gold, but really holding British securities. And what happens is that sticks together, price level is flat, it actually rises by one measure in the United States until this. That's the Great Depression starts. And then what happens is there's a downward force on the price level. And you see this, I don't know if you can see my pointing. Anyway, there's a downward force in the price level. And to me, it looks like, wow, this was a temporary arrest. The gold exchange standard was patched together in a way that it didn't fit together. There were lots of IOUs traded across countries that kind of built on sand. And they kind of got called during the Great, that got pushed down. And then what happened is, so there's a force going down, and Irving Fisher sees this. Irving Fisher wants a stable price level. And he actually influences Franklin Roosevelt to leave the gold standard and to engineer a price inflation to consciously to redistribute between creditors and debtors. Because if you're a creditor and you're owed gold here, you're getting really high returns here. And so speaking of returns, like here's two wars. So notice what I'm doing. I'm setting up to write a paper on COVID, the COVID war, and about returns. Here's cumulative return. If you put $100 in gold and lend it to the U.S. government, here's what happens. In the blue line is the Civil War, and you suffered during the Civil War. You got low rates of return. Your cumulative return, you were way down at the end of the war, and then after the war, look what happened. You got really high returns. That's a cumulative real return on debt. So really, now look what happens after the and Franklin Roosevelt knew these numbers. Look what happened after the World War I. It's kind of the same pattern, high returns, and then it's kind of shut down during the 20s. You're doing okay. It's a little inflation, and then the Great Depression happens, and now you're really kind of copying this line. Franklin Roosevelt says, I'm going to stop this. And he's very explicit, using very good economics, Chicago economics, how he's going to stabilize the price level by going to a well-managed fiat system that he says can beat the gold standard. And it's not original. He's just reading what Irving Fisher, the great American economist, told him. Okay, anyway, that's it. Okay. Forgive my enthusiasm. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
But the deflationary periods were very different. The first one, the economy was booming. The second one, the economy was crashing or was doing very poorly. So the alternative returns.
Okay, that's an interesting. Okay, that's Marcus. That's really controversial. I agree with you, but there's a number of historians who say that the 1870s were a period of the Great Depression. If you read the Oxford History of the United States, he says like the Grant administration long period of Great Depression tries to document it. I don't believe him, but he says they weren't that different. But despite that, and there was a lot of agitation. There was a lot of agitation in the 1870s to do what Roosevelt did. And President Grant, he actually vetoed something called the inflation bill. It was a close call. But your question kind of opens up a PhD thesis, a beautiful one. Okay, so here's another paper George and I wrote. Hey Marcus, would you give me a 10-minute warning, because I want to make sure I get to something.
Yes.
Okay.
You have about 15 minutes.
Okay, good. Okay, so here's the following. So people tell you, especially if you're in a family like mine, people just make fun of economists, so you can never predict anything. Okay, well, it's kind of true. It's just saying things that are a random walk. That does pretty well. But anyway, so here's an instance where a young economist just got his PhD. His name was Henry Carter Adams, and this is one of my favorite passages. I think this is his PhD thesis. So here's the stage. 1887, 1885. United States is a net debtor to foreigners. And we're a rapidly growing economy that's importing lots of capital and exporting lots of IOUs and claims on US assets. And every year, we're getting more and more in debt. That's the situation. That's one aspect of the state. Here's another aspect of the state. In the 19th century, throughout the 19th century, the US had a isolationist policy. We didn't interfere with other countries. We were anti-colonialists. The only country we interfered with was the western part of the United States, where we were taking Native Americans and exterminating them, or else putting them in reservations. So we didn't do anything abroad. Isolationism was our policy. So Henry Carter Adams says the following thing. He says, look, we're growing very fast. And because we're growing really fast and we're importing a lot of capital, eventually, this is an early version of secular stagnation, which was kind of in the wind. He says, look, returns are going to fall. Returns on US securities are going to fall and, approach levels of domestic, British securities. He says that. And he says, when that happens, and furthermore, US is growing and it's going to become, returns are going to fall. US is going to grow and we're going to become a leading economy. We're going to catch up with Britain, maybe exceed it. And he says that's going to eventually transform the US into a net foreign creditor. And these credits are going to be issued not by the government, but by private American savers. And he said, when that happens, he said, that's going to unleash political forces for the US to abandon its isolationist foreign policy. Because just like the British and the French, in the 19th century, they used gunboat diplomacy to enforce the IOUs repayments by debtor countries. Go look at the history of how the French got into and the British got into North Africa. It started with government debts. And there's a famous distinguished Arab nationalist. He said, I fear French banks more than I do the French army. That's what he had in mind. And Adams, of course, read that stuff. And he said, that's going to happen here. So we're not going to be isolationists. And he said, we ought to be thinking about this and have a policy. So what's his paper? And actually his book, it's about what he said came true. The United States goes into World War I still it's a creditor, a debtor, and it comes out a big, it halfway through the war, it becomes an international creditor with big IOUs owed by the British, French, and Italian governments of the United States. It's a long story why the Germans didn't know us any. And that, many people, like I'm of that view, it tipped the hand of the United States to enter the war. And after the war, there's this huge fragile international debt system set up. So that's if you haven't studied that, it's really good. It's really good to look at. After the war, Britain and France owed the United States huge government debt, and the British and French they had a way to collect it. They were going to impose reparations on the Germans, and the United States played the moral high ground and said, "Well, you shouldn't do that. We want a peace without victory." And the British and the French, I'm oversimplifying, but I'm telling you the essence. The British and the French said, "Okay, we won't insist on reparations, and we'll have a generous peace if you, the United States, write off lots of our loans, give us big haircuts. And the United States government said, of both parties, said the issues aren't at all related. So what you got after the war was huge reparation payments due. They were unsustainable in the political sense, if not in the economic sense. Things were patched together in a temporary way, partly with the gold exchange standard, but it fell apart at the beginning of the Great Depression. And many people, scholars and historians and economists, think that this imperfect, patched together, unsustainable debt system was a big contributor to the Great Depression. Further,
yeah. Tom, a nerdy question. Hi, this is Saki. So did Keynes mention that US-British link in his?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. He did. Yeah, and economic consequences of the peace. Okay, so in this whole thing is this whole paper is about unanticipated consequences of actually getting into war and then patching up a debt system. So here's something I recommend reading. This one of the unanticipated anticipated consequences was huge debt crises all over the developed world in the early 30s, and lots of beggar thy neighbor policies. Many countries participated in it. We left the gold standard in a very messy way. Franklin Roosevelt has been criticized for torpedoing a London economic conference. And if you actually drill down and read his, this message, the history books that are often taught when they still used to teach history in the United States, was that Roosevelt's message was really foolish. Well, we have it in this paper. If you read, it's not foolish at all. It reads like Milton Friedman wrote it. It's distinctions between temporary and permanent, and look at the fundamentals and what his goals were, price level stability, and so on. So, and he actually has a kind of heterogeneous agent classical model, I would say. He's really focused on redistribution associated with unanticipated inflation. Anyway, okay, fast. Right now, Congress is within weeks of passing or not passing a debt limit. So the US has had a debt limit passed by Congress every year since 1939. But before 39, it didn't have a debt limit. And why? You kind of ask why, and what do you do instead? Well, it turns out, George and I wrote this little paper. It turns out before 1939, Congress designed each bond. It wasn't designed by experts like, Marcus or Saki. It's designed by the US Congress in a committee. They designed each bond, and each bond had a particular amount that could be issued, a limit bond by bond of how much you could issue and what you could use it for. And often it was, and the bonds were, this is the thing Jonathan, Payne and has assembled, and George assembled these data. The bonds were often peculiar. They were designer bonds, and they had special features. You could only use them for certain stuff. And so after in the decade after World War I, the Congress started delegating, as US Congress has delegated lots of authority to the executive. Lots of stuff that the Constitution says only Congress can do. Now Biden or Trump can do. And this is one of them. So what George and I did is we reconstructed government debt limits bond by bond. So I don't know, this isn't showing up so good. Well, I don't know what I do. But anyway, if you notice, here's the debt limit since, I'm gonna try to do so. This is dangerous. No, I don't know what's happening. Anyway, the debt limit is in red. The blue is the actual debt. Since World War II, it's never been lowered. And it's going to be raised again. Okay, so it's kind of a charade. But here's what George and I'm sorry about these slides, I don't know why. The red is the debt limit, and the blue is the actual debt. And this is from the beginning of the Republic. If you look at what the debt limit is that George and I added up bond by bond, it used to be binding and it was often lowered. And there were episodes where the president wanted to issue more debt and he couldn't do it legally. So that changed. This is kind of a poor man's mechanism design. You can kind of ask why it changed. There's some good economics and history to be done. Kenneth Garbade wrote a book that has pieces of the puzzle. Now I'm going to tell you about 2 more papers and then I'm going to stop. Okay, so here, George and I have this paper, just came out in the Handbook of Historical Economics, call it 8+2. It's debt and taxes in 8 US wars and 2 insurrections. You know, the revolt against Great Britain and the Southern revolt against the United States. And we have various themes that we have, we kind of ask, you know, how wars were financed, how was debt marketed? Was it retail or wholesale? Who, you know, what were the intermediaries, banks or brokers or movie stars? During World War I and II, it's movie stars. What was the central bank role? In a couple of wars, there was no central bank. And what were the returns to bondholders during and after the war? And what were the consequences for price levels? So we've organized the data, and we have 2 models that guide us there, the Barrow model and the Lucas and Stokey model. Yeah, so the Barrow model, the souped up version of the Barrow model, it's tax smoothing and precautionary saving. That's what his model's about. Incomplete markets, very incomplete markets, and you precautionary save. The Lucas and Stokey model is, there's lots of insurance markets, complete markets, and the government finances things by entering into a insurance deal with the public. And this 8+2 shows there's elements of both. You know, like I'll give an example. You say insurance, there's no insurance, really? So here's what the United States government did during World War I and after. Makes a deal. It says, we're gonna subsidize our merchant marine because we want ships to carry stuff in case of war, and we're gonna subsidize it, or we're gonna subsidize railroads in peacetime. Excuse them from taxes. We're going to subsidize things, and then what's the deal? During the war, we nationalize them. And if you kind of look at the budget constraint implications, that looks a lot like an insurance arrangement. That's just an example. Okay, so here's what we have, some price levels that I'll show you. And now I want to show you the final project. So we have stories about price levels and returns in that paper. So here's the current work. Okay, and some really smart, some great energy is going into this. Okay, so here's what we're doing. We are constructing historical yield curves for U.S. government debt. We're using our data on prices and quantities of all these bonds, and then we're going to use them to back out yield curves. That's what we're doing. So it turns out we don't have we have lots of data, but the data are sparse along some dimensions. So we can't use, turns out we can't copy what the very, very good work that the for example, the Federal Reserve Board does. What they do is they use a Nelson-Siegel model, and they like fit it every week because they have so many bonds, and they can do it. So what we have in effect is a panel with lots of missing data, and we couldn't possibly do the Nelson-Siegel model because we're sparse. So what do? We use prejudice or inductive bias. What we do is we write down I should say Ballin and Jonathan did that remarkable work on this, or are doing. We write down a Nelson-Siegel model with time-varying coefficients. And then we use we map it into a hidden Markov model. And then we use Bayesian inference. And we use Julia to do Hamiltonian Monte Carlo and what's called NUTS, no U-turn sampling. And we use something called Turing.jl. And that's what we do. So here's our, we started doing this with a Litterman-Shankman model, which was a level slope and curvature model. And we switched, for some reason the Fed did, is we fit this with this Nelson-Siegel model, which has some really nice features. And what we do is we make all these parameters. You'll see this is a 4-parameter model. I count right. There's a tau. We make these time varying, and they have some drift in them. So that's our model. And actually, we estimate a model with 7,000 parameters, if you want to think. There's 7,000 parameters, but we have hyperparameters that can control things. Okay, I don't have the killer graph here yet. Okay, so here's what we do: is we use these to construct 10-year yields that we compare. We would use them to construct many things. This is ongoing work. The computer's running as I speak. But we've kind of we've constructed yield curves for U.S. government securities, denominated in gold because we were on the gold standard, and we compare them with other numbers that have been used in the historical series. And this black line's our number, and look how beautiful this is. This is what Bayesian HMC can do. That black line those are Bayesian coverage intervals. So we just don't report the yield. We report our uncertainty. That's associated with the posterior. So that's the posterior. The black's the posterior median, and these are coverage. So you see there's uncertainty. You could say, well, wait a minute, why didn't you do this? Well, Donald Trump's hero, Andrew Jackson, completely paid off the government debt. Donald Trump had President Andrew Jackson's picture behind him. It was always in it. And I don't think he knew much about what Andrew Jackson did, because Andrew Jackson hated debt. He loved balanced budgets. Anyway, so he paid off the debt. That's why there's no numbers here. And then you notice our numbers during the Civil War during some wars, they're very different from the official numbers that are used, say, in lots of the historical literature. So we have gaps. So we kind of agree with some of the historical. If you look at the way Homer and Scylla, these are good people. They didn't have access, or they didn't use the data we had. They didn't collect them. They did something that was back of the envelope, not unreasonable, but doesn't work well during the war periods. So then I'll just conclude with the following thing. This is kind of a lesson. Remember, I started at one point saying there's this reputational theme. Hamilton and the founders wanted to, they had this promise. Hamilton says, like here's the thing. Hamilton says we can lower interest rates by servicing our debt reliably. That's a forward-looking thing, and it's a reputation. There were other guys who said, oh no, we can lower our interest payments just by defaulting. Hamilton's an idiot. How can you lower your interest payments by, by paying more to bondholders? Anyway, so that tension's going on. So, the founding fathers and some of their opponent, at least the founding fathers, were thinking about that in what, Abreu, Pearson, Siketio says, pretty sophisticated way. But here's the drama. So this red line is the British, they're very influenced by what's going on. That's the British 10-year yield. Okay. And then the black one's the US. And it took almost a century for US yields to come down to below, to the level of British yields. And then here's what happens with World War I. And notice the British yields are creeping up. So there's a drama in this story about how it's actually quite modern drama about this graph and the fiscal and monetary discipline that led this black line. See, it looks really bad here. The Civil War. There's a great debate after the Civil War, and the people cited Hamilton. They said, we want to continue Hamilton's program. That's what Grant said, and they did it, and they achieved his objective. I think I'm almost sure that there's discussions going on, at least in some central banks outside of the United States, that want to be maybe 50 years from now the international currency, and they're probably learning some lessons from these patterns in the history. So thanks for your patience. I'm done.
Thanks a lot, Tom. That's a very insightful talk and going to the big picture. Are there any questions? Otherwise, we go later to Tremba and we can have more informal conversations over there too. If not, I would like to throw in, is there some resemblance between the Napoleonic Wars for the UK, where they went back to the gold standard and hence probably could get some low interest rate from that compared to the Civil War experience in the US? Or do you see any similarities there? Or?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I love the question for the following reason. So the people, so in the United States, the people who are doing this, so remember, the Napoleonic Wars they end in 1815. And then there's a debate. There's a huge debate about should we, the UK was off gold. The Bank of England notes were not convertible. And there's a debate, should we go back to gold? And if so, should we go back at par? And there's some people say, no, don't go back at par because you're going to have a deflation. And David Ricardo, wrote this wonderful thing, said, if you don't go back at par, you might as well not go back at all, because people aren't going to, the whole thing is about following through on a promise. So he made a reputational argument. And, Americans, political figures and statesmen, they read a lot more than they knew about Ricardo's argument. They knew about the British experience and they were trying to copy it. So yeah, it was the intellectual influence across the Atlantic and across time. See, I'm bad at math. This is only 45 years after Ricardo gave that talk. So there's lots of young guys. I noticed, like Saki, he did 45 years. He thinks that's, but 45 years ago, Lucas wrote the Lucas critique 50 years ago. And the previous talk, mentioned it. So, those ideas hang around.
So I had some thoughts I would like to share after listening your talk. Is there room for this, Marcus, or should we leave it?
Go ahead.
So one thing I mean I get that in the minds of these policymakers or fathers of the nation, there's like this paradox because on the one hand they're tying their hands not to use fiat money as a source of financing, and one thing I gather from your pictures, but that's not the trade-off I want to highlight, is that I'm used to thinking, well, maybe they don't want to do that because inflation is inflation tax is too distortionary, but what it seems to me that I'm getting a sense from your pictures is that really they were bothered more by the redistribution than rather than the inflation tax per se. And I say this because they could have just said, okay, we're gonna end up in a new level, but no, they're saying we have to go back to where it was. So that's different, but that's different from what I've been taught. But anyways, the trade-off that I want to highlight is that you also mentioned this discrimination between bonds and other types of government liabilities. But to have that discrimination, you need to have some form of non-arbitrage behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
So they're giving up away the ability to use some asset that is dominated in return that makes government deficit financing cheaper. So on the one hand, they're thinking, well, there's some distortion, but I'm gonna give away this form of financing that is cheaper and for some reason.
Yeah. So you put a lot of. So you have a book to recommend. It's a masterpiece. It's called Novus Ordo Seclorum. It's by Forrest McDonald. And what it is, it's an account of a state by state, almost person by person account of the political negotiations and log rolling and fears and hopes that went into the forming of the U.S. Constitution in the 10 or 15 years beforehand. And one of the big things that was on the plate, and it's on the minds of the founding fathers, is in a number of states, there were schemes from quote unquote debtors to issue lots of state paper money, make it legal tender, and pay off a bunch of private debts as well as government debts. So redistributions all over the place. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, Saki, you mentioned no arbitrage. There's an arbitrage. Yeah, there's an arbitrage. So, but guess what? This is a period when banks had to see. This is a period. Banks had to be chartered either by states or the central government, and there were very few banks. And to the extent there were a few banks. There's banks in the states, and if you read that book, some of the schemes are, we can have the state government raise some revenues through by being the only one who can do this arbitrage, but not completely, not enough to wipe it out. So everything you put on, what's amazing.
This book has some quotes regarding those.
Oh yeah,
those insights.
Yeah. And let me see, your questions bring up the following thing. So here's a criticism. This is a famous criticism. If you read the history literature, it's called presentism. So, and here's what a historian would say was in this whole talk and all these papers is, I'm committing what's called the sin of presentism. I'm using current models. I'm using a lot of reputational. I mentioned Abu Pearson Spaghetti, Barrow, Lucas and Stokey. Those are models that were invented in the 80s. Rational expectations. You mentioned arbitrage. I'm using all those things. They weren't even invented, and I'm putting them in the head of policymakers, 200 or 100 years ago. And they're saying that's completely biased. And that's a charge that's often made by serious historians. I'd say, but I think there's a great answer. And it's that lots of these things about reputation, you know, Abu Pearson-Staketty and Freudenberg weren't the first ones to think about reputation. They were formalizing things.
Yeah.
We can have a fun discussion.
Are there any other questions? Just go ahead. Otherwise, we can meet in the virtual beer garden, which is on Tremba. Are there any direct questions now before moving on to the virtual beer garden?
Okay, thanks, Marcus.
No, thanks a lot, Tom. This was fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I probably will watch it again on YouTube.
Okay.
Just to